He was forced to marry an obese stranger, but no one expected what happened next. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In the dusty plains of the Old West, where life was harsh and survival was the name of the game, there lived a rancher named Jack Thompson. He had lived a quiet, solitary life for years, tending to his land, his animals, and his responsibilities. The death of his parents had left him with a sprawling ranch, but little companionship. Despite his strong, muscular build and rugged looks, Jack was known to keep to himself. He didn't care much for the social gatherings in town, preferring the solitude of his land over the noise of the world. Jack's life was simple, but one decision would change everything. One fateful day, as he stood near his barn, a messenger arrived from a neighboring ranch. The man was a representative of the wealthy Darnell family, a name known across the region for its immense power and influence. The message was clear. Jack had been called to marry someone. Not for love, not for passion, but for an agreement made years ago, long before Jack had ever set foot on this land. The Darnell family had arranged the marriage as part of a land contract. Jack was to marry Caroline Darnell, the only daughter of the family, to secure a deal that would grant him the land he had always dreamed of. There was just one problem. Caroline Darnell was nothing like the women Jack had imagined marrying. She was large, towering over most men, and with a physique that many would call massive. Her face, while kind, was often ridiculed by others, and her size made her a subject of mockery in the town. No one expected Jack to agree to such a union, but the deal was clear: marry Caroline, and Jack would gain the ranch expansion he had always wanted. Without much choice, Jack reluctantly agreed, knowing that turning down the offer would mean losing everything he had worked for. The day of the wedding arrived, and Jack found himself standing before a large, grand altar. The guests, all from the wealthy side of the region, whispered amongst themselves. They couldn't believe that Jack, a proud, independent rancher, would marry Caroline. But Jack had his own reasons for agreeing. He didn't want to be the laughingstock of the town, and the prospect of owning more land was far too tempting to resist. As Caroline entered the room, Jack couldn't help but notice her face, full of warmth and kindness, despite the uncertainty in her eyes. She had never wanted to be married off either, but the Darnell family had placed their expectations upon her shoulders. Caroline walked slowly toward Jack, her movements graceful despite her size. The wedding ceremony proceeded, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was making a huge mistake. He wasn't sure if he could love a woman who had been ridiculed her whole life. But as Caroline placed her hand in his, the weight of her touch surprised him. There was strength there, a quiet power that Jack had never seen before. And as they exchanged vows, Jack began to feel something unexpected stir within him, a sense of duty, but also curiosity. What was it about Caroline that no one seemed to see? What was it about her that Jack had failed to notice before? Little did he know, the decision he had just made would turn his world upside down, and no one could have predicted what would happen next. As the days passed after the wedding, Jack found himself adjusting to a new life he never expected. Caroline, despite her size, was nothing like the woman he had imagined marrying. She was kind, humble, and full of life. Each day, she seemed to bring warmth into the house, her gentle nature turning even the coldest corners of Jack's heart. But despite this, Jack still felt a distant discomfort, as though something in his life had shifted in a way he wasn't ready for. The town had reacted as expected. The whispers started almost immediately. People who had once respected Jack for his independence now whispered behind his back, questioning his motives. Some said he had done it for the land, others for the money, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he had been judged and found wanting. His reputation, which had once been untarnished, was now overshadowed by his new marriage. The ridicule from the townsfolk was constant, but Caroline, despite hearing the mocking words, never let it affect her. She simply went about her daily chores, her resilience showing in the way she carried herself. She made breakfast every morning, made sure the barn was in order, and even helped Jack with the cattle. As time went on, Jack began to notice something unusual. Despite his initial resistance, he was beginning to appreciate Caroline's presence. It wasn't just her ability to handle the ranch, though that was impressive in itself. It was the little things, the way she always smiled, even when the weight of the world seemed to bear down on her. The way she could calm the animals with just a touch, and how she always made sure Jack had everything he needed, without ever asking for anything in return. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack returned to the house to find Caroline sitting on the porch, looking up at the stars. He had noticed her sitting there often, as though she was lost in thought. It was a quiet moment, one that Jack had come to treasure. He sat down beside her, and for the first time since their wedding, they talked without the usual tension between them. They talked about the land, about their pasts, and about the future. Caroline shared stories of her childhood, of the days before her family had fallen into debt, and how she had always been the one to help her father manage the farm. Jack, in turn, spoke about his life as a rancher and the loneliness that had defined his years before meeting her. For the first time, Jack saw Caroline not as a burden, but as a partner. Her size no longer seemed like a limitation, but a part of the strength she carried within. As the weeks turned into months, their bond deepened. Jack began to realize that his life had changed for the better. His feelings for Caroline were evolving in a way he hadn't expected. The woman he had married out of duty was becoming the one person he could no longer imagine living without. One evening, as they worked in the fields, a storm rolled in quickly. The wind howled, and rain began to pour down in torrents. Jack shouted for Caroline to take shelter, but she refused. She insisted on finishing the work, saying they would be fine. Jack was taken aback by her determination. He had seen her work hard before, but this was different. The storm grew fiercer, but Caroline pushed through, her strength shining in the midst of the chaos. Jack stood there, watching her. In that moment, he saw the depth of her resilience, the way she faced every challenge head-on, no matter the odds. It was at that moment that Jack realized the truth. Caroline wasn't just his wife. She was a force of nature, and he was falling in love with her. As the storm raged on, Jack took a step toward Caroline, grabbed her hand, and said, "Let's finish this together." And from that day forward, Jack knew that no matter what the world thought of their marriage, he had made the right choice. Caroline had become his equal, and together, they would face whatever came next. As the seasons changed, so did the relationship between Jack and Caroline. The bond they had formed in the beginning, born out of necessity, was now growing into something deeper. Jack had never imagined that a marriage of convenience would evolve into something so meaningful. The daily work on the ranch was still hard, but it no longer felt like a burden. Every task was shared, every challenge faced together. Jack found himself waking up every morning with a sense of gratitude that he hadn't felt before, and it wasn't just because of the land or the cattle. It was Caroline. Her laughter had become the soundtrack of his mornings, and her presence gave him a peace he never knew he needed. But despite the growing affection between them, the world outside their ranch hadn't changed. The town's whispers never ceased. Jack could still hear the murmurs of his neighbors, the quiet judgments that followed him wherever he went. Caroline, too, felt the sting of their cruel words. She had been the subject of mockery her whole life, and no matter how kind or capable she was, the townspeople could never see past her size. Jack had always been a man who valued strength and determination, and over the months, he had come to appreciate these qualities in Caroline more than anything else. Yet, the prejudice from the outside world was hard to ignore. One evening, as they were walking back from the fields, a group of local men, who had been drinking at the saloon, spotted them. The comments were loud, harsh, and cutting. "Look at him," one of them slurred. "Married to a woman who can barely walk without breaking a sweat." Another man laughed. "Wonder how much land he had to give up to get someone to marry him." Jack felt a surge of anger rise within him, but he didn't speak. Caroline, however, heard the words clearly. She could feel the weight of every insult like a blow to her chest. She had spent her life trying to avoid such cruelty, but it seemed like it was everywhere she went. Jack saw the look in her eyes and knew he couldn't let this continue. He had to do something. The next day, Jack made a decision. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it was time to stop hiding. He would confront the townspeople. He would show them that Caroline was more than just her size. As he walked into the saloon that afternoon, the murmurs began immediately. The men stopped talking, their eyes following him as he approached the bar. Jack took a deep breath, gathered his thoughts, and stood tall. "I'm here to set something straight," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Caroline Thompson is my wife. She is a strong, capable woman who has worked harder than any of you ever have, and I will not tolerate anyone mocking her or our marriage ever again." The room fell silent. Jack didn't flinch. "So, if you have something to say it to me," he continued. "But I promise you, if you ever speak about my wife again, you will have to answer to me." The tension in the room was thick, but Jack didn't back down. Slowly, one by one, the men looked away, their expressions shifting from defiance to shame. They had expected Jack to be a different kind of man, one who would cower to their opinions. But he wasn't. Caroline, who had been standing by the door, felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had never seen Jack so confident, so unwavering in his love for her. That moment marked a turning point. The town no longer controlled their lives. Jack and Caroline were a team, and no one could take that away from them. As they left the saloon, Jack turned to Caroline with a smile. "You don't have to listen to them anymore," he said softly. "We've got each other." Caroline's eyes filled with tears, not from sadness, but from a deep sense of gratitude. For the first time, she felt seen, valued, and most importantly, loved. Jack had shown her that love wasn't about appearance or what others thought. It was about respect, trust, and standing by each other, no matter what. From that day on, the town's opinions seemed distant, irrelevant. Jack and Caroline built a life together, not just on the land, but in each other's hearts. They proved that love could overcome any obstacle, and that true beauty came from within. As time passed, Jack and Caroline's life together began to settle into a comfortable rhythm. The ranch was thriving, the work still hard but rewarding, and their relationship was stronger than ever. The whispers from the townsfolk had faded, replaced by a newfound respect for Jack and his wife. The bond they shared was undeniable. Caroline, once seen as an outsider, now had a place in the community. People began to see her for what she truly was, a hard-working, intelligent woman who had proven herself time and time again. But, as with all things in life, peace would not last forever. One afternoon, as Jack and Caroline were working together in the barn, a letter arrived, bearing the official seal of the Darnell family. Jack opened it with a sense of unease, already knowing that something was about to change. The letter was short but clear. It was from Caroline's father, Charles Darnell, a wealthy landowner who had never fully accepted Jack's marriage to his daughter. Charles had come to terms with the marriage, but there was something that still hung in the balance. The letter stated that Caroline was expected to return to the Darnell estate for a family gathering, and that Jack was to accompany her. It was a call that Jack could not ignore, but he was reluctant. He knew the Darnell family's history, their control over the land, and the power they wielded in the region. Jack had always believed that the Darnells looked down on him. He was, after all, just a rancher, a man of the earth, while they were a family of wealth and influence. Still, he knew Caroline's place in her family's life was important, and he didn't want to stand in the way of her responsibilities. The day of their departure arrived, and Jack and Caroline made the long journey to the Darnell estate. As they neared the grand mansion, Jack's nerves began to surface. The estate was everything Jack had imagined it would be, sprawling, imposing, and opulent. It was a stark contrast to the modest ranch they had built together. Caroline seemed calm, though Jack could see the tension in her eyes. She had not been back to her family's estate in years, and Jack could sense the weight of her past there. When they arrived, they were greeted by Charles Darnell, who was as imposing as the estate itself. He was a tall man, graying at the temples, his face stern but not unkind. Caroline had inherited much of her beauty from him, but she also shared his quiet strength. "Welcome, Jack," Charles said, his voice low but steady. "And Caroline, it's good to see you." Jack nodded respectfully, but Caroline didn't respond immediately. She seemed lost in thought, her eyes distant. It was clear that returning to her family's home was not an easy thing for her. Dinner that evening was held in the grand dining room, where the family gathered. Charles, his wife, and their 2 sons sat at the table, along with a few other dignitaries. The air was thick with formality, and Jack felt out of place. He had always been uncomfortable around people like the Darnells, people who spoke in riddles and dealt with land, as if it were nothing more than numbers on a piece of paper. But Caroline, to his surprise, was at ease. She held her own in conversation, and Jack found himself watching her, amazed at how much she had grown. She wasn't the same shy girl he had married. She was a force of nature in her own right, standing tall among the people who had once looked down on her. As the evening wore on, Charles leaned in, his voice dropping to a quieter, more serious tone. "Jack, there's something important we need to discuss," he said. Caroline's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't speak. Jack, sensing the tension, looked at her. "What's going on?" he asked. Charles glanced at Caroline before continuing. "There's a deal I've been working on. A land acquisition that could benefit us all. But I need your help, Jack. I know you have experience in these matters." Jack was taken aback. "What kind of deal?" he asked. Charles explained that a neighboring landowner was selling off a massive plot of land that would increase the Darnell family's holdings significantly. The deal, however, was complicated, and Charles wanted Jack's expertise in managing the ranch and overseeing the negotiations. It was a significant opportunity for Jack, one that could change the course of his future. But the catch was clear. By accepting, Jack would be more deeply tied to the Darnells than ever before. Jack didn't hesitate. He could see the opportunity in front of him. But he also knew that this would mean more time spent with the Darnell family, more dealings with the world he had spent so long avoiding. He glanced at Caroline, her expression unreadable. She had never been comfortable with her father's world, but now, it seemed, she was the bridge between the two worlds, hers and Jack's. "I'll help," Jack said, finally breaking the silence. "But on one condition." Charles raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Jack's voice was firm. "I want us to do this together, Caroline and I. This isn't just my decision. It's ours." Caroline looked at Jack, a mixture of surprise and pride in her eyes. Charles hesitated but then nodded. "Very well," he said. "But understand this. This will change everything." As Jack and Caroline left the Darnell estate that night, their future had just been set on a new path. They had come for a family gathering, but now they were facing a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. As Jack and Caroline headed back to the ranch after their meeting with the Darnells, the weight of their decision settled over them. Jack was still processing what had happened, the offer from Charles, the land deal, and the promise he had made to Caroline. The magnitude of it all was starting to feel overwhelming. He had never been one to mix business with family, but this was different. This was an opportunity, a chance to secure a future that could benefit not just him, but Caroline as well. As they rode in silence, Jack glanced over at Caroline. She was deep in thought, her face calm, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She had always been caught between two worlds, the world of her family and the world of the ranch. Jack had seen it before, the way she struggled to reconcile her past with her present. But he could sense something had shifted in her. Caroline had come into her own over the past few months. She was no longer the timid woman who had married him out of duty. She was strong, assertive, and now, she was ready to take her place in this new chapter. When they finally reached the ranch, Caroline broke the silence. "Jack, what do you think we should do?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Jack took a deep breath, considering her words. "I think we should go for it," he said. "This could change everything for us. But I won't do it without you. I want this to be our decision, not just mine." Caroline nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'm with you," she said. "But we need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Jack agreed. The decision had been made, but now they had to prepare for the challenges ahead. The Darnells were powerful, and their involvement would come with its own set of complications. But Jack was determined. He had made a promise to Caroline, and he would keep it, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly to prepare for the negotiations. Jack spent long hours in the barn, working on the land, while Caroline focused on managing the household and ensuring everything was in order. The two of them worked side by side, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. But despite the hard work, a feeling of unease lingered in the air. Jack knew that the deal with the Darnells was not going to be simple. Charles Darnell had made it clear that this was a business transaction, and Jack was under no illusion that the Darnell family was acting out of anything but self-interest. But he also knew that this was the best chance they had. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Jack and Caroline rode to the Darnell estate. Jack's nerves were on edge, but Caroline remained calm. She had faced her father and the Darnell family her entire life. She knew what to expect. When they arrived, they were greeted by Charles and the other members of the Darnell family. The atmosphere was formal, businesslike, and Jack could feel the tension in the air. Charles wasted no time getting to the point. "Jack, Caroline," he said, his voice cold. "I trust you've thought about the offer. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. We're prepared to offer you a significant amount of land, but in return, I expect your full cooperation." Jack nodded, his mind racing. He knew that if they accepted, they would be tied to the Darnell family in ways that went far beyond land. But this was their chance to secure their future. "We're ready to move forward," Jack said, his voice firm. Caroline looked at him, her expression unreadable. She had always been cautious, but Jack could see the determination in her eyes. This was her family, but this was also their life. "But we have one condition," Caroline added, her voice steady. Charles raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "And what is that?" he asked. "We want to ensure that this deal is mutually beneficial," Caroline said. "We don't just want land, we want control over it. We want to be partners, not just tenants." The room fell silent. Jack held his breath, waiting for Charles's response. For a long moment, Charles didn't say a word. Finally, he spoke. "You're asking for more than I'm willing to give," he said, his tone sharp. "But if you're willing to stand by your words, then we have a deal." Jack and Caroline exchanged a look. It was a bold move, but they had no other choice. This was their chance to take control of their future, and they weren't going to let it slip away. As they left the Darnell estate that day, Jack felt a sense of accomplishment. They had made their stand, and now they had to see it through. But he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The Darnell family didn't make deals lightly, and the consequences of their decision would soon become clear. But no matter what came next, Jack and Caroline were ready. Together, they could face anything. And in that moment, Jack knew that no matter what the world threw at them, they would always stand by each other. As the days turned into weeks, Jack and Caroline's decision to take control of their future began to feel like a weight, both a responsibility and a challenge. The deal with the Darnell family had been struck, but what seemed like a simple negotiation had quickly turned into something more complicated. The Darnells were powerful, and Jack knew they weren't the type to make deals lightly. Caroline had been right to demand a partnership, but now it was clear that the family would push them to their limits. Jack spent long hours going over the contract, reading the fine print, making sure that nothing had been left to chance. Caroline, too, was deeply involved in the process, offering her insights and sharp instincts. Together, they worked tirelessly to ensure that the deal would benefit them both, not just in terms of land, but in terms of autonomy and respect. However, the pressure was starting to mount. The Darnells were not used to being questioned, and Jack and Caroline could feel their resistance growing. Charles Darnell, who had initially seemed agreeable, was becoming more demanding with each passing day. Jack knew the Darnells were testing them, pushing their boundaries to see how far they could go. One afternoon, after a particularly heated discussion with Charles, Jack rode back to the ranch, his mind racing. He felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The land was theirs now, but at what cost? The Darnells were powerful, and the more they pushed, the more Jack feared they would lose their independence. As he rode through the fields, Jack noticed Caroline standing near the barn, looking out over the land. Her posture was strong, but Jack could see the worry in her eyes. He dismounted and walked over to her, his boots crunching in the dry earth. "Caroline," he said softly, his voice heavy with the weight of the situation. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." Caroline turned to him, her face calm but determined. "I know," she said, "but we have to keep pushing. This is our chance. We can't back down now." Jack nodded, but the doubt in his mind lingered. They had fought so hard for this, but now, it seemed like the Darnells were trying to take it all away. He couldn't let that happen. He looked out over the land that had become their home, the land they had fought for. It was everything they had worked for, everything they had built together. And he wasn't about to let it slip away. "We'll fight for it," Jack said, his voice firm. "We're in this together, Caroline. We've come too far to back down now." Caroline smiled, her eyes shining with determination. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the fields, Jack and Caroline knew that their fight was far from over. The Darnells might have the power, but Jack and Caroline had something they didn't: each other. And together, they would face whatever came next. The following week, Jack and Caroline prepared for another meeting with the Darnells. This time, however, they knew they had to be strategic. They couldn't just give in to the pressure. They had to stand their ground, show the Darnells that they were not to be pushed around. When the day arrived, they met with Charles and the Darnell representatives at the estate. The tension in the room was palpable. Charles, as always, was calm and composed, but Jack could sense the undercurrent of hostility. "We've been patient," Charles said, his voice cold. "But you must understand, this deal is not just about land. It's about control." Jack's heart raced, but he kept his composure. "We understand," he said, his voice steady. "But we won't allow ourselves to be controlled. We've worked too hard for this, and we're not backing down." Caroline stepped forward, her presence strong. "This is a partnership, Charles," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not a takeover. We're willing to work with you, but we will not be subjugated." The room fell silent. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. Then, slowly he nodded. "Very well," he said. "If you insist on making it a partnership, then we'll proceed. But understand this. Things will be different from here on out." Jack and Caroline exchanged a glance. They had made their stand, and for the first time, the Darnells had backed down. As they left the Darnell estate that day, Jack felt a sense of triumph, but he knew the battle was far from over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles, but as long as they stood together, they could face anything. The land was theirs, and they would fight to keep it. And no matter what happened, Jack knew that their love for each other would always be their strongest weapon. The weeks following their confrontation with Charles Darnell were both tense and rewarding for Jack and Caroline. Their resolve had been tested, but they had emerged victorious. The partnership with the Darnells had been solidified, and the land was now officially theirs. The negotiations were far from over, but they had set a precedent. They would not be easily manipulated. The ranch flourished under their careful management. Caroline's insight into the business side of things, combined with Jack's experience in the field, proved to be a powerful combination. The cattle were healthy, the crops grew strong, and the land, once a distant dream, was now a thriving part of their future. Yet, despite the growing prosperity, there was always a lingering sense of unease. The Darnells had not been fully satisfied with the terms of the deal, and Jack knew that Charles would not forget the challenges they had presented. Caroline, too, was aware of the delicate balance they had struck. She knew that the Darnells would be watching closely, waiting for any misstep, any sign of weakness. One morning, as Jack and Caroline were riding out to check on the herds, Caroline's expression was unusually quiet. Jack noticed her distant gaze, and for the first time, he saw the weight she carried. "What's on your mind?" Jack asked, slowing his horse to ride alongside hers. Caroline hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about what Charles said the other day," she said. "About control. I know we've made our stand, but I can't shake the feeling that we're just pawns in a bigger game." Jack nodded, understanding her concern. He, too, had felt that nagging sense of vulnerability, but he had pushed it aside, focusing instead on the work that needed to be done. "What do you think we should do?" Jack asked, genuinely curious. Caroline took a deep breath. "We need to be prepared for whatever comes next. I don't trust the Darnells. They've always seen us as beneath them, and I don't think that will change just because we've won one battle." Jack looked at her, his heart swelling with admiration. Caroline's strength, her ability to see things from every angle, was one of the many reasons he had fallen in love with her. "You're right," Jack said, his voice steady. "We can't afford to let our guard down. We've worked too hard to let anyone take it all away." Caroline smiled at him, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Together," she said simply, "we'll face whatever comes next together." In the days that followed, Jack and Caroline prepared for the inevitable challenges that would come with their new partnership. They knew that the Darnells would be relentless in their pursuit of control, and they needed to stay one step ahead. One afternoon, as Jack was inspecting the farthest corner of the property, he saw a familiar face approaching on horseback. It was Boone Carter, the Darnell family lawyer. Jack's stomach tightened. Boone had always been a messenger of bad news. As Boone dismounted, he gave Jack a curt nod, his face impassive. "Jack," Boone said, his voice cold, "I have a letter from Mr. Darnell." Jack took the letter, his eyes narrowing. He could tell from Boone's demeanor that this wasn't just a routine communication. He broke the seal, and read the letter quickly. Mr. Darnell requires your presence at the estate, Boone continued. There are new developments regarding the land acquisition. Mr. Darnell expects your full cooperation in this matter. Jack's mind raced. The Darnells had agreed to the terms, but now, it seemed, they wanted more. He could feel the tension building, the walls closing in around him. I'll be there, Jack said, his voice firm. Boone nodded and turned to leave, but not before offering one last remark. Don't take this the wrong way, Jack, Boone said, his voice laced with subtle menace. But you're in over your head. The words hung in the air long after Boone had ridden away. Jack stood there for a long moment, the letter still clutched in his hand. He knew this was just the beginning. The Darnells were not done with them. As he turned back toward the ranch, he looked at Caroline, who was waiting for him by the barn. He could see the concern in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Jack knew what they had to do. They had to go to the Darnell estate. They had to face whatever Charles had in store for them. Together, they had built something strong, but the Darnells had always been a formidable force. Jack could only hope that their partnership, their shared resolve, would be enough to protect what they had worked so hard to build. Jack and Caroline arrived at the Darnell estate the following afternoon, their minds heavy with the uncertainty of what awaited them. The long ride had given Jack plenty of time to think, but it had not prepared him for the cold, imposing grandeur of the estate. The tall gates opened slowly as they approached, the heavy iron creaking under the weight of time. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone walls casting long shadows across the courtyard. The once appealing facade now felt like a fortress, a place where deals were made behind closed doors and power was wielded without mercy. As they dismounted from their horses and approached the entrance, Jack could feel his pulse quicken. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that always accompanied meetings with Charles Darnell. Caroline stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but Jack could see the quiet determination in her eyes. She was ready for whatever came next. The doors of the mansion opened, and they were ushered inside by a servant who did not speak, only motioned for them to follow. The grand hall was dimly lit, the light from the large windows outside casting long, eerie shadows on the polished floors. It felt as though time itself had frozen here, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to be part of something far larger than either of them had anticipated. At the far end of the hall stood Charles Darnell, his cold eyes studying them with a calculating gaze. His posture was stiff, but there was a sense of power about him that was hard to ignore. Caroline had never been fond of her father, and Jack could see why. Charles had the look of a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, and he had the resources to make it happen. Jack, Caroline, Charles said, his voice smooth but carrying a hidden edge, I'm glad you could make it. He didn't offer them a seat, nor did he show any warmth. It was clear that this meeting was about business, not family. We've made progress, but there are still a few matters to settle. I trust you both understand the gravity of the situation. Jack nodded, though his gut churned. We understand, he replied, his voice steady. But I think we need to be clear about what we're agreeing to. This isn't just about land anymore. It's about power, and we want to make sure we're not giving away more than we should. Caroline stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. We've agreed to the terms, Father. But we need to make sure that we're both getting what we deserve. This is a partnership, not a takeover. Charles studied them both for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. A partnership? He repeated, as if the word tasted strange in his mouth. I suppose you could call it that. But make no mistake, this land is mine, and I will decide what happens with it. You are guests in this arrangement, not the ones in charge. Jack could feel his temper rising, but Caroline reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a silent reminder to keep calm. She spoke again, her voice unwavering. We are partners, Father. And if that's not what you want, then perhaps this deal is not what we thought it was. Charles's face darkened, and for a moment, Jack thought he might lose his cool. But he held his ground, his voice colder now. You're in no position to make demands, Caroline. You're lucky you even have this opportunity. Jack stepped in then, his voice firm. We've worked hard for this, Charles. And we won't let you manipulate us. If you think you can push us around just because of who you are, you're wrong. There was a long silence as Charles took in their words. The air was thick with tension, and Jack could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. For the first time, he realized that this wasn't just about land or money. It was about respect. Caroline and Jack had fought for everything they had, and they weren't about to let anyone take that away from them. Finally, Charles broke the silence, his voice low and measured. "Very well," he said. "If you want to play it that way, then let's see what you're truly capable of. You may have your partnership, but I warn you, this isn't over. There are things you don't know, things you haven't seen. And if you want to succeed, you'll need to prove yourselves." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jack and Caroline standing in the grand hall. The tension had not lifted, but now they knew exactly what they were up against. It wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was a test of everything they had built together. As they walked out of the mansion, Jack and Caroline exchanged a look. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. Whatever the Darnells had in store, they would face it together. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready. They had each other, and that was all they needed to fight for what was rightfully theirs. The days following their tense meeting with Charles Darnell were some of the most challenging Jack and Caroline had faced. The Darnells had made it clear that they were not to be underestimated, but Jack and Caroline were resolute. The next few weeks were spent in preparation for whatever the Darnells had planned, knowing that the real test was still ahead. Jack spent long hours working the ranch, ensuring that everything was running smoothly. Caroline, too, was busy, not just with the usual chores, but with organizing the finances and ensuring that their legal position was as strong as possible. They knew that this deal, despite their initial success, was far from settled. But even in the midst of the pressure, something had changed. The more they worked together, the more their bond strengthened. It wasn't just about the ranch anymore. It wasn't even just about the Darnells. It was about the life they had built together. Caroline had become more than just his wife. She had become his partner in every sense of the word. She was the one he could turn to when things were difficult, the one who saw the world as he did, and, more importantly, believed in the same things he did. One evening, after a long day, they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The land stretched out before them, vast and beautiful. Caroline turned to Jack, her face soft in the fading light. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" she said quietly. Jack nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "We have," he said, "and we're not done yet." There was a quiet strength in his words, a certainty that had not been there when they first started. They had come so far, but Jack knew the hardest part was still ahead. The following day, they received a letter from the Darnells. It was a formal invitation to another meeting, this time at the estate. They were to finalize the terms of the land deal. Jack and Caroline knew this was the moment they had been waiting for, but there was something in the letter that made Jack uneasy. It wasn't the usual formal tone. There was an edge to it, a subtle hint that the Darnells had not finished pushing. Still, they couldn't back down now. They rode to the estate together, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. As they arrived, the same cold, imposing mansion greeted them, its stone walls as unyielding as ever. Inside, they were led to the same room where they had confronted Charles before. This time, however, there was no waiting. Charles Darnell stood at the far end of the room, his expression unreadable. He was alone, no other family members present. The atmosphere was thick with tension. "Jack, Caroline," Charles began, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of something darker. "I trust you've had time to reconsider our terms?" Jack stood tall, his voice steady. "We've thought it through, Charles, and we're ready to finalize this deal. But on our terms. This is a partnership, not a transaction." Caroline stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm. "We won't be dictated to, no matter how much power you have." Charles studied them both, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Very well," he said. "I believe you have earned the right to be heard. But understand this. Even in a partnership, there are those who hold more power. And that's something you will have to accept." Jack felt a surge of anger, but he kept his calm. "We're willing to accept a fair deal, but we won't be controlled by you or anyone else." There was a long silence as Charles weighed their words. Finally, he spoke. "You've done well, both of you. But let's be clear, this isn't over. There are forces at play here that you don't fully understand. But for now, the deal is yours. Proceed with caution." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Jack and Caroline standing in the silence. They had won. For now. As they left the Darnell estate that day, Jack and Caroline exchanged a glance. It wasn't just a victory over the Darnells. It was a victory over the forces that had tried to tear them apart from the beginning. Together, they had overcome everything: prejudice, doubt, and manipulation. They had fought for what was theirs and had come out stronger for it. As they rode back to the ranch, the weight of the journey finally began to lift. They had done it. They had built a life together, a life that was theirs to live, no matter what challenges came their way. And in that moment, with the land stretching out before them, Jack knew that no matter what happened next, they would face it together. They had everything they needed: each other.